Maya, sweetheart, I need to tell you something about this weekend. My mother's voice came through the phone with that particular casual tone she used when she was about to deliver news she knew I wouldn't like but had already decided wasn't worth worrying about. I was standing in my tiny apartment kitchen 3 days before my master's degree graduation, stirring pasta I'd already lost my appetite for, and something in her inflection made my hands stop moving. Your father and I won't be able to make it to your graduation on Saturday. Emma's boyfriend Tyler is having his 25th birthday party that day, and it's going to be this whole big thing at that beautiful rooftop venue downtown. You know the one? And Emma really needs us there. The words hit me like a physical blow, and I had to set down the spoon because my hand had started shaking. This couldn't be happening. Not again. Not for this. Mom, this is my master's degree graduation, I said, hearing my voice come out smaller than I intended, hating how it already sounded like I was begging. I'm receiving the Distinguished Scholar Award. I'm giving a speech. The dean specifically asked if my family would be there because they want to meet you both. There was a pause, and I could hear her moving around, probably cooking dinner, probably not even fully focused on this conversation that was quietly breaking my heart. It's just a ceremony, honey. You'll walk across a stage for a few seconds and get a piece of paper. We've been to graduations before. Tyler only turns 25 once, and Emma has been planning this party for months. She'd be devastated if we didn't come. I wanted to scream that I only earned my master's degree once, that I only got selected for the university's highest academic honor once, that I only got accepted to Stanford's PhD program with a full scholarship worth over $200,000 once. But the words stuck in my throat the way they always did. This was the pattern of my entire life, wasn't it? I was 24 years old, and I had spent all of them learning that my achievements, no matter how significant, would always come second to my younger sister's social calendar. My undergraduate graduation, where they left halfway through to take Emma on a college tour. My high school awards ceremony they missed entirely for Emma's cheerleading competition. My 8th grade science fair, where I won first place in the regional competition, and they barely looked up from their phones because Emma had a friend crisis that demanded their attention. I had published research in Nature Biomedical Engineering. I had spent 4 years working 18-hour days to develop technology that could help amputees regain natural limb function. And my parents were going to miss watching me be honored for it because my sister's boyfriend of 8 months was having a birthday party. Before continuing the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers to be able to bring you stories like this every day. For you, it's just a click, but for me, it means a lot. After I hung up with my mother, I stood in my kitchen for what felt like an hour, but was probably only minutes, watching my pasta water boil over and not caring enough to turn down the heat. My mind had already traveled backward through 2 decades of moments just like this one, a highlight reel of dismissals and disappointments that I'd spent years trying to convince myself didn't form a pattern. My undergraduate graduation from this same university 4 years ago had been on a beautiful May morning, and I'd walked across that stage with honors cords and a summa cum laude designation that I'd worked myself to exhaustion to earn, and my parents had been there for that one, sitting in the audience with Emma, who was 18 then and in her senior year of high school. I remember the relief I felt seeing them in their seats, the way I'd scanned the crowd nervously beforehand, and felt my chest loosen when I spotted my mother's red jacket. I remember thinking that finally, I was doing something significant enough that they couldn't help but be proud. The ceremony lasted 2 hours, and I was somewhere in the middle alphabetically, and when my name was called, I heard my father's voice shout above the crowd, and I felt something warm and validating spread through me as I shook the dean's hand. But 20 minutes after I'd walked, after they'd taken the obligatory photos in front of the university banner, my mother checked her phone and her expression shifted into that particular look of concern she reserved exclusively for Emma, and she announced they needed to leave because Emma had a college tour at a school 3 hours away and they'd scheduled it for that afternoon. I'd stared at her in my polyester gown with my degree holder still empty because they hadn't distributed the actual diplomas yet, and I'd asked if they could stay just through the end of the ceremony, maybe get lunch after to celebrate like we'd planned, and my father had that apologetic look he always got when he was about to choose Emma over me, but wanted me to know he felt slightly bad about it. Maya, honey, you already walked. That's the important part. Emma's college visit is scheduled, and you know how competitive admissions are. We need to support her future, too. They'd left me standing there in the courtyard with other graduates and their families who were heading to celebration lunches and taking dozens of photos, and I'd gone back to my apartment alone and eaten leftover Chinese food and told myself it was fine. I was an adult now. I didn't need my parents to celebrate with me. Before that, there was my high school award ceremony junior year, where I'd received recognition for being the top student in AP Chemistry, AP Calculus, and AP English Literature simultaneously, and I'd been selected as one of 10 students nationwide to receive a scholarship from the National Science Foundation for my independent research project on sustainable water filtration systems. The ceremony was on a Thursday evening in the school auditorium, and I'd reminded my parents about it for weeks. And the day of the event, I'd worn my nicest dress, and my hands shook with nervousness and excitement as I waited backstage to be called up. Emma had a cheerleading competition that same evening 2 towns over, some regional preliminary round for a state competition that wouldn't happen for another month. My parents didn't come to my ceremony at all. I accepted my awards in front of teachers and other students' families and pretended I didn't notice the empty seats, pretended I didn't care that the most significant academic achievement of my teenage life was happening in front of strangers. The worst part about the pattern of my parents choosing Emma over me wasn't just the individual instances of disappointment, though those hurt enough on their own. It was the fundamental narrative that had been constructed about who we were as daughters. Roles we'd been assigned so early I couldn't remember a time before them. Labels that had calcified into identities neither of us had really chosen, but both of us had learned to perform. Emma was 22 now, still working on her undergraduate degree at a state school 2 hours away, and she'd changed her major 3 times in 4 years, moving from communications to marketing to event planning, each switch accompanied by a dramatic phone call to our parents about finding her true passion, each new direction funded without question or concern about the accumulating student loans that my parents had co-signed and would probably end up paying themselves. She was beautiful in that effortless way that had always drawn attention. The kind of girl who'd been popular in high school without trying, who had hundreds of friends on social media, and a rotating cast of boyfriends who were always treated by our parents like potential sons-in-law, even when the relationships lasted only months. Tyler was the latest, a 25-year-old assistant manager at a tech startup who Emma had been dating for exactly 8 months, and my parents talked about him like he was already part of the family, asking after him on phone calls, including him in holiday planning, treating his birthday party like a wedding reception worth $8,000 at an upscale venue. Emma had always been the pretty one and the social one, labels my parents used with obvious pride, voices warm with affection when they talked about her latest relationship drama or social triumph. I was the smart one, and they said it differently, with a kind of resigned acknowledgement, the way you might note that one child is tall or left-handed, a factual observation without the glow of celebration. I remembered being 12 years old and overhearing my mother on the phone with her sister, talking about her daughters, and she'd said, "Emma is going to break hearts, but Maya will do well in school." And even then, I'd understood the hierarchy embedded in those expectations. Which future was considered more valuable, more worth celebrating? The financial disparity made it concrete in ways I'd tried for years not to calculate, but couldn't help tallying in quiet moments of resentment I felt guilty for feeling. My parents had paid for Emma's spring break trips every year of college, beach vacations with friends that cost thousands of dollars, justified as important social experiences, and necessary breaks from her studies that were producing a 2.7 GPA and an uncertain major. I had worked 3 jobs simultaneously through my undergraduate years: washing dishes in the dining hall before my 8 a.m. classes, tutoring economics students in the evenings, doing data entry remotely on weekends, cobbling together enough money to cover what my academic scholarships didn't include, while my parents sent Emma on trips to Cancun and Miami. When Emma turned 21, our parents had thrown her a party that cost $15,000, a celebration at a country club with a hired DJ and catered dinner, and a cake that was 4 tiers of elaborate fondant decoration, 200 people invited to toast their beautiful daughter's entrance into adulthood. When I turned 21, I was in the middle of midterm exams, and my parents sent a card with $50 in it and a text message saying, "Happy birthday, sweetie. Let's celebrate when you're home for Thanksgiving." And when Thanksgiving came, the celebration was dinner at Olive Garden, where my father mentioned my birthday once during dessert, and Emma spent the meal talking about her new boyfriend. I called Priya 20 minutes after I hung up with my mother, after I'd finally turned off the stove and dumped the ruined pasta down the disposal and stood at my kitchen window looking out at the parking lot below without really seeing it, and she answered on the second ring with her usual bright energy that I envied and needed in equal measure. "Maya, 3 days until we're officially masters of the universe. Well, masters of science, but close enough." I could hear the smile in her voice, and I tried to match it, but something in my attempted response must have betrayed me because her tone shifted immediately into concern. "What happened? What's wrong?" I told her about the phone call, about Tyler's birthday party, and the $8,000 venue, and my mother's casual dismissal of my graduation like it was a minor scheduling conflict, instead of the culmination of 6 years of brutal academic work. And with each detail I shared, I could hear Priya's breathing change on the other end of the line, could feel her anger building in a way that mine hadn't been allowed to. "Are you kidding me right now? Maya, tell me you're kidding. Tell me your parents did not just skip your master's graduation for some random guy's birthday party." She wasn't yelling, but her voice had that sharp edge it got when she was genuinely furious. And I found myself doing what I always did, softening the blow, making excuses, trying to make it sound less terrible than it felt. I mean, they already committed to being there, and Emma would be really upset if they canceled, and it's not like they're doing it to hurt me, they just don't really understand that this graduation is different from my undergraduate one. Priya was quiet for a moment, and I could picture her in her bedroom down the hall from mine in our shared apartment, probably sitting cross-legged on her bed, the way she did when she was processing something that made her angry. And when she spoke again, her voice was softer, but somehow more intense. "Maya, do you hear yourself right now? You're making excuses for them. You've been making excuses for them your entire life. This isn't about them not understanding. You told them this was important. You told them you're receiving a special award. You told them you're giving a speech. They understand perfectly well. They just don't care enough to choose you over Emma's boyfriend's birthday party." The words hit me harder than I expected, and I felt something twist in my chest, that familiar feeling of being simultaneously defensive and knowing she was right. They care. They're just, they've always been more focused on Emma, and I've learned to be okay with that. I don't need them there to validate my achievement. Priya made a sound that was half laugh and half frustration. "Okay, first of all, that's the saddest thing I've ever heard you say. And you once told me you ate dinner alone in a bathroom stall in high school because you didn't want people to know you had no one to sit with. Second, yes, you should need them there. They're your parents. You should be able to expect them to show up for the biggest moments of your life." I didn't know what to say to that, so I said nothing, and Priya filled the silence with details about her own family's arrival plans, how her parents were flying in from Seattle the morning of graduation, how they'd insisted on bringing her grandmother, even though the flight was hard on her, how they'd booked a hotel for 3 nights so they could celebrate properly, and help Priya pack for her move to San Francisco, where she'd be starting at Google in 6 weeks. The contrast between her family's enthusiasm and my parents' absence felt like a physical weight, and Priya must have sensed it, because she circled back to the original topic with a question that would end up haunting me for the next 3 days. Maya, when are you going to stop accepting being treated like you don't matter? I deflected with something about it being fine, about being used to it, about focusing on the positive. But after we hung up, her question stayed with me, echoing in the quiet of my apartment like an accusation I couldn't answer. I waited until evening to call my father. After I'd spent most of the afternoon alternating between staring at my laptop screen, pretending to work on final revisions to my thesis presentation, and refreshing my phone to see if my mother might text something different, some acknowledgement that she'd made a terrible mistake. But nothing came, and finally around 7 p.m. I hit his contact and listened to it ring 4 times before he answered with his usual warm greeting that made me momentarily forget why I was angry. "Maya, how's my brilliant daughter?" he said, and I could hear the television in the background. Probably a basketball game because it was playoff season and he never missed a game. And I thought about how he'd missed my graduation, but not a sports broadcast, and had to push that thought down before I could speak. "Dad, I wanted to talk to you about graduation on Saturday." "Mom said you're not coming because of Tyler's birthday party." There was a pause, and I heard the television volume lower and him sigh, and I knew before he spoke what kind of conversation this would be, could predict the shape of his response because we'd had versions of this conversation my entire life. "Your mother told me you two talked. Maya, sweetheart, you know we'd love to be there, but your mother already RSVP'd to Tyler's party weeks ago, and Emma would be absolutely devastated if we didn't show up. You understand, right? You've always been so independent, so capable of handling things on your own." The words landed like they always did, like compliments wrapped around dismissal, praise that somehow justified neglect because I was strong enough not to need them, and I felt something hot building in my chest that I didn't want to name yet. "Dad, this isn't just graduation. I'm receiving the Distinguished Scholar Award. I'm giving the student address as the program representative. The dean is personally recognizing my research. This is the highest honor the university gives to graduate students." I heard pride in my own voice and hated that I was still trying to convince him I mattered enough to choose. "That's wonderful, sweetheart. We're so proud of you. That's incredible. Can you record it? I'd love to watch your speech. Maybe you could send us the video and we could have a special dinner when you visit next month?" His voice was genuinely warm, genuinely proud, and that somehow made it worse because he meant it. He was proud. He just wasn't proud enough to actually show up. Wasn't proud enough to choose me over a birthday party for a man who'd been dating Emma for less time than it took most people to know whether a relationship would last. "You want me to record my own graduation so you can watch it later while you attend a birthday party for someone who isn't even family." I said it flatly, without inflection, because if I added emotion, I would start crying, and I was tired of crying over this. "Maya, that's not fair. Tyler is important to Emma, and Emma is important to us. You know how sensitive she is. If we missed his party, she'd be heartbroken, and it's not like your graduation is something that can't be celebrated later. You'll have other accomplishments. This is Tyler's 25th birthday." The casual dismissal broke something in me that I hadn't known was still whole, some last fragile hope that if I just explained it clearly enough, he would understand, he would choose me, he would see me, and I heard myself say, "Okay, Dad," in a voice that sounded nothing like mine, and ended the call before he could say anything else. Emma called an hour later, after I'd sat on my couch in the dark for what felt like both minutes and years, staring at my phone and wondering if I'd just permanently damaged my relationship with my father by not being understanding enough, by not being easy enough, by not being the independent, capable Maya who never needed anything from anyone. And when her name lit up my screen, I felt a complicated mix of hope that maybe she was calling to fix this, and dread that I already knew she wasn't. "Maya, hey," she started, and her tone was that careful one she used when she was about to say something she knew I wouldn't like but planned to say anyway. That tone that meant she'd rehearsed this conversation in her head and decided she was right before we'd even spoken. Mom told me you're upset about graduation, and I just want you to know that I didn't know Tyler was planning his party for that day. It just happened to fall on the same weekend. But Maya, we already booked the venue. It's at the Skyline Room downtown, that gorgeous rooftop place with the city views. It cost $8,000. 8,000. We put down a non-refundable deposit of 3,000. You could just graduate. I can't just have a birthday party. The words came out in a rush like she'd been holding them in. Like she was the reasonable one explaining basic logistics to someone being deliberately difficult. And I felt something cold settle in my stomach because I realized she genuinely believed what she was saying, genuinely thought an $8,000 party for her boyfriend was more important than my graduation, genuinely saw herself as the victim in this situation. Emma, Tyler chose that date. He could change it. The venue would work with you on rescheduling. This is my master's degree graduation. I'm receiving the Distinguished Scholar Award. I'm giving the student address. I kept my voice level, kept trying to make her understand, and I hated that I was still trying, still hoping she would suddenly see me and choose me and acknowledge that maybe, just maybe, my achievement mattered as much as her boyfriend's birthday. "Why do you always have to make everything about you?" she said, and I actually laughed because the irony was so sharp it cut. "This is important to me, Maya. Tyler is important to me. Mom and Dad being there is important to me. You've had graduations before. You'll have other accomplishments. This is his 25th birthday at this specific venue that we've been planning for months." I thought about pointing out that she'd known my graduation date for over a year, that it had been on the university calendar since last summer, that Tyler had chosen this date either knowing it conflicted or not caring enough to ask. But I was tired of explaining, tired of justifying my right to matter in my own family. "You could come visit next weekend and see all the photos," Emma continued, warming to this solution like it was generous rather than insulting. "We're hiring a professional photographer, and Tyler's friend is doing a video. It'll be like you were there. And we can celebrate your graduation then, too, make it a combined celebration." She said this brightly, like she'd solved the problem, like suggesting I view party photos was equivalent to my parents attending the biggest academic achievement of my life, and I realized with a clarity that was almost painful that Emma genuinely didn't understand what she was asking, genuinely couldn't see the difference between a birthday party and a once-in-a-lifetime honor, genuinely believed her social life was just as important as my 6 years of brutal academic work, and nothing I said would make her understand, because she'd never had to understand. She'd never been the one asked to step aside, to be flexible, to understand, to make it easy for everyone else. The night before graduation, I sat on my couch in the apartment I shared with Priya, staring at my regalia laid out on the coffee table like artifacts from someone else's life. The black gown with its velvet trim and the hood lined in Stanford cardinal red that I'd earned through 6 years of work so brutal, I sometimes wondered if I'd remember my 20s as anything other than fluorescent library lighting and the smell of laboratory disinfectant. And I found myself seriously considering just not going, just skipping the ceremony entirely, packing away the regalia, and pretending tomorrow was just another Saturday. Because what was the point of walking across a stage to accept an award with no one there who'd known me before I became Dr. Chen's star research assistant? No one who remembered me as anything other than achievements and publications, and the thought made me pick up the honors cords, the gold one for summa cum laude and the blue one for the biomedical engineering department, and the special braided one in university colors that marked distinguished scholar recipients. And I remembered the 4 years of 18-hour days that had earned these cords, remembered the semester I'd worked on the prosthetic limb interface technology that would eventually become my published paper. Remembered the night I'd finally gotten the neural feedback loop to work correctly and had called my mother at 11 p.m. because I was so excited I couldn't contain it. And she'd said, "That's wonderful, honey, but I'm helping Emma pick bridesmaid dresses online. Can I call you back?" And never did. Remembered my thesis advisor, Dr. Sarah Chen, who'd spent countless hours mentoring me and who'd nominated me for the Distinguished Scholar Award and who'd written in her nomination letter that I was the most dedicated and innovative student she'd supervised in her 15-year career. And I thought about the research itself, about the breakthrough in prosthetic limb technology that could genuinely help thousands of amputees regain not just function but sensation, could give people back a piece of what they'd lost. And I realized with a clarity that cut through the hurt that I was sitting here considering hiding my achievement, considering making myself smaller and invisible to avoid feeling the pain of my parents' absence. And that's when the anger finally surfaced. Real anger, not just hurt. Anger that I'd spent 24 years making myself easy and understanding and independent so they wouldn't feel bad about choosing Emma. Anger that I'd apologized my way through a lifetime of being second choice. Anger that even now I was thinking about protecting them from embarrassment rather than celebrating what I'd accomplished. And I stood up and put on the regalia right there in my living room at 10 p.m. the night before graduation. Put on all the cords and the hood and looked at myself in the mirror and made a decision that felt like taking my first full breath in years. I would attend, I would walk across that stage, I would accept the Distinguished Scholar Award, I would give my speech, and I would celebrate myself even if my family wouldn't, because I'd earned every single thread of these honors, and I deserved to claim them. Graduation morning arrived with the kind of bright May sunshine that felt like a mockery of my emotional state. And I stood in my bedroom at 6 a.m., staring at my regalia laid out on the bed and feeling simultaneously proud and hollow, like I was preparing for both a triumph and a funeral. And when Priya knocked on my door an hour later, she found me sitting on the floor in my underwear and honors cords, which would have been funny, except I'd been crying, and she could tell, and she didn't say anything about it, just helped me up and said, "Let's get you into this gown, Chen. You've got history to make today." And her hands were steady and sure as she arranged the hood with its Stanford cardinal lining and made sure all 3 honors cords lay correctly. The gold for summa cum laude, and the blue for biomedical engineering departmental honors, and the special braided one in university colors that only distinguished scholar recipients wore, and she took what felt like 100 photos of me in our apartment, by the window where the morning light came in, holding my empty diploma folder since the actual diploma would be presented at the ceremony. And I was trying to smile genuinely, and mostly failing when her parents knocked on our door, and her mother swept in with her grandmother, and her father carrying pastries from the expensive bakery downtown, and they'd set up this whole pre-graduation brunch in our tiny living room, bagels and fruit, and the kind of celebration that made my chest ache, because this was what families did. This was what showing up looked like. And Priya's mother hugged me so hard I could barely breathe and said, "We're so proud of you, Maya. Both of you girls are brilliant daughters. Your parents must be absolutely bursting with pride." And the words hung in the air for just a moment before Priya caught my eye, and I saw her minute head shake, her silent offering to change the subject. But Priya's mother was looking at me expectantly, warmly, waiting for me to share in the mutual joy of parental pride, and I heard myself say, "They couldn't make it today. They had a prior commitment." And the words came out steady and neutral like I was commenting on weather, and the change in the room was immediate and terrible. Priya's mother's face shifting from joy to confusion to something like horror, and her father set down his coffee cup with enough force that it clattered and said, "They're not coming? To this? To your graduation?" And I explained about Tyler's birthday party, about the Skyline room, about the $8,000 and the non-refundable deposit, and I watched these people who'd known me for only 4 years, through Priya's stories and occasional visits, process information that made no sense to them, that violated some fundamental understanding of how parents should behave, and Priya's father said with a quiet intensity that somehow meant more than shouting, "Maya, their loss. Do you hear me? You are extraordinary, and today we celebrate you." And Priya's grandmother, who was 86 and usually quiet, took both my hands in hers, and said something in Hindi that Priya later translated as, "The family you're born into and the family you choose are both real, and sometimes the second one loves you better." And I cried then, couldn't help it. And they held me and fed me bagels and made me feel like maybe I could do this. Could walk across that stage without my parents and still hold my head up. And 2 hours later, when we arrived at Morrison Auditorium, the university's most prestigious venue reserved for graduate ceremonies, and I saw the hundreds of families already gathering, the flowers and balloons and cameras, and the electric excitement of celebration. I also saw the 4 empty seats in the section I'd reserved, fourth row center, the seats that had my parents' names on them that I'd submitted back in March, along with my request for guest tickets. And those empty seats felt like they took up more space than all the filled ones combined. Felt like they were broadcasting my inadequacy to everyone in the building, and I stood there in my regalia with all my honors cords and my empty diploma folder, and thought about how my parents were probably at the Skyline room right now, probably already taking photos of Tyler cutting into whatever elaborate cake Emma had ordered, probably toasting to his 25th year with champagne, probably not thinking about me at all. The reception before the ceremony was held in the Chancellor's Hall, adjacent to the main auditorium, a room with high ceilings and long windows that let in streams of morning light, and it was reserved specifically for honors graduates and their families, intimate and celebratory, with tables of refreshments and faculty members circulating to congratulate students. And I stood near the windows with Priya and her family, feeling exposed and conspicuous because everyone else seemed to be in clusters of celebration, students surrounded by parents and siblings and grandparents. And that's when I saw Dr. Sarah Chen making her way toward me through the crowd, her face lighting up when she spotted me, and she was wearing academic regalia that marked her as full professor, and she looked so proud. And when she reached me, she took both my hands and said, "Maya, there's my star. Are you ready for today?" And I managed to smile and said I was, and her eyes swept past me looking for the family she'd probably assumed would be surrounding me. And her expression shifted from expectation to confusion, and she said, "Where are your parents? I've been wanting to meet them all year." And I felt Priya stiffen beside me, felt her silent support. And I heard myself say with a calm I didn't feel, they couldn't make it today, they had a prior commitment. And Dr. Chen's face did something complicated, confusion giving way to what looked like contained anger, and she said, "Couldn't make it? Maya, you're receiving the Distinguished Scholar Award. You're the first master's student in 15 years to publish in Nature Biomedical Engineering. You're giving the student address." And each phrase came out with increasing disbelief, and I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. And Dr. Chen looked like she wanted to say more, but instead she squeezed my hands hard and said, "Then I'm staying with you today. You're not doing this alone." And she kept her word, staying close as we moved through the reception. And she introduced me to Dean Richard Morrison, who I'd met only briefly before, a tall man in his 60s with silver hair and the kind of presence that made rooms go quiet. And Dr. Chen said with emphasis, "Dean Morrison, this is Maya Chen, our Distinguished Scholar recipient." And the dean shook my hand warmly and said, "Maya, I've read your research 3 times, absolutely groundbreaking work. Your parents must be overwhelmed with pride." And there it was again. That assumption that parents would naturally be present and proud, and Dr. Chen interjected before I could answer, "Maya's family couldn't attend today." And something flickered across the dean's face. Surprise, and then what looked like concern, and he said carefully, "I'm sorry to hear that. Is everything all right? No emergency, I hope?" And I could have lied, could have invented some acceptable excuse, but instead I heard myself say, "No emergency. They had another event to attend." And the dean looked at me for a long moment, like he was seeing something that troubled him. And he said, "I see," in a tone that suggested he saw more than I'd said, and then he smiled and said, "Well, the university family is here for you today, and we're honored to celebrate your achievements." But I noticed he filed the information away somewhere. Noticed the way he glanced at Dr. Chen with an expression I couldn't quite read, And as the reception continued and we were called to line up for the processional into the auditorium, I saw Dean Morrison pull out his phone and type something quickly before putting it away, and I wondered what he was thinking, wondered if he found it as incomprehensible as Priya's parents had, that someone could miss this day. But mostly, I was just trying to hold myself together as we prepared to enter the auditorium, where 300 people would be celebrating their graduates, and I would be walking toward 4 empty seats that represented 24 years of being second choice. The ceremony began with the traditional processional, and I walked into Morrison Auditorium with the other honors graduates at the front of the line. Our multiple chords marking us as special, even among this accomplished group, and the orchestra was playing pomp and circumstance, and the audience of probably 800 people rose to their feet as we entered, and I kept my eyes forward, because I knew if I looked at the section where my parents should have been sitting, I might break down completely. And the program clutched in my hand was thick as a magazine, because there were 300 graduates, and each one would have their name called and their moment on stage. And I thought about how my parents would have had to sit through every single name, would have had to wait probably 90 minutes just to see me walk across that stage and receive my special recognition and give my speech. And apparently that was too much to ask. Apparently, Tyler's 25th birthday party at the Skyline Room, with its $8,000 venue fee and its elaborate decorations, was more deserving of their time. And I wondered what they were doing right at this moment. Probably toasting with champagne, probably taking group photos with Tyler at the center, grinning like he'd accomplished something more significant than surviving another year, probably not thinking about me at all. Or maybe thinking about me briefly with mild guilt before Emma said something that made them feel justified in their choice. And we took our seats in the front section, and Dean Morrison walked to the podium and welcomed everyone and made the standard remarks about achievement and pride and the families who supported these graduates, and that word kept coming up: family support. The people who believed in you, and each mention felt like a small knife. Because I was sitting there in my regalia with my 3 honors cords and my empty diploma folder, and the knowledge that in the 4th row center section, there were 4 empty seats with my parents' names on them, and the ceremony proceeded through its various stages: the welcome and the faculty recognition, and then the beginning of graduate name-calling. And they started with the doctoral candidates first, only 15 of them, each one getting extended recognition and applause. And then they moved to the master's graduates and started calling names alphabetically by department. And biomedical engineering was early in the alphabet, so I knew my general walk would come soon. Not the special recognition, but just the standard crossing of the stage that every graduate got. And I watched as other students' names were called, and they walked up and shook hands and received their diploma folders and paused for the official photograph. And I watched their families in the audience, the way mothers cried and fathers took videos, and siblings held up signs, and everyone cheered like this was the most important moment in history. And I realized that my parents could have had this, could have been those people in the audience bursting with pride, could have been taking photos and crying and cheering, could have been part of this celebration that they'd helped make possible, even if they'd never acknowledged that help. And instead they were at a birthday party for a 25-year-old man who my sister had been dating for 8 months, and the unfairness of it settled in my chest like a physical weight. And when they called Maya Chen, and I stood and walked to the stage and shook the department chair's hand and accepted my diploma folder and smiled for the photographer, I heard Priya's family cheering loudly in their section, and I heard Dr. Chen's voice calling my name, and I heard scattered applause from the larger audience. But what I heard most clearly was the silence from the 4th row center, the absence of the voices that should have mattered most. And I returned to my seat holding my diploma folder and thinking that this was what my entire life had been: achievement met with absence, success celebrated by everyone except the people I most wanted to notice. After the individual master's graduates had been called and returned to their seats, Dean Morrison returned to the podium, and the atmosphere in the auditorium shifted into something more formal and weighty, and he said, "We now come to our special recognitions, the awards that represent the highest achievements of this graduating class. And he explained that the Distinguished Scholar Award was given to only one graduate whose research, scholarship, and character exemplified the university's highest ideals. And as he spoke, I felt my heart begin to pound, because this was the moment I'd been both anticipating and dreading. The moment when my achievement would be most visible and my parents' absence most conspicuous. And Dean Morrison continued. This year's recipient completed her master's degree in biomedical engineering with a perfect 4.0 grade point average, but grades alone do not earn this recognition. And he described the prosthetic limb research I'd spent 2 years developing, the breakthrough in neural interface technology that could help amputees regain fine motor control, and he said, at 24 years old, she became the youngest researcher in our department's history to publish as lead author in Nature Biomedical Engineering, one of the most prestigious journals in her field. And I could hear murmuring in the audience, people impressed by credentials they were only now learning about, and the dean went on, she has been accepted to Stanford University's doctoral program with a full merit scholarship, and their faculty have already indicated she's among the most promising researchers they've recruited in years. And then he said the words that made it real. Maya Chen represents the very best of what education can achieve, what dedication and brilliance can accomplish, and it is my profound honor to present her with this year's Distinguished Scholar Award. And the applause began as I stood on shaking legs and made my way to the stage, and I was aware of Priya's family cheering loudly, and Dr. Chen standing to applaud, and other faculty members I recognized joining the ovation. But I was most aware of the fourth row center section where 4 seats sat empty and silent, and I climbed the steps to the stage where Dean Morrison waited holding a wooden plaque with brass engraving, and when I reached him, he shook my hand firmly and turned us both toward the photographer for the official photo. And the applause continued, but it felt hollow somehow, like sound traveling through water, distorted and distant, because the voices I most needed to hear weren't there. And Dean Morrison leaned close as he handed me the plaque and whispered, "Where is your family, Maya?" And the question was gentle but direct. And I looked up at him and saw genuine concern in his eyes, and I whispered back, "They couldn't attend today." And something shifted in his expression, confusion giving way to what looked like carefully controlled anger, and he held my hand a moment longer than protocol required, and said quietly but with intensity, "Stay available after the ceremony. I need to speak with you." And I nodded, not understanding what he meant, but recognizing that something significant had just passed between us. And then I returned to my seat, carrying the plaque that represented 2 years of 18-hour days and groundbreaking research and everything I'd sacrificed to get here, and I sat down with this physical proof of my worth in my hands, while 4 empty seats stared back at me like accusations. I returned to my seat holding the plaque with both hands like it might dissolve if I loosened my grip, and the weight of the brass and wood felt substantial and real in a way that the rest of the ceremony somehow didn't. And I could feel Dean Morrison's eyes on me as I sat down, could feel the question he'd asked hanging in the air between us, and I wondered what "stay available after the ceremony" meant, and why his expression had shifted so dramatically when I'd admitted my family wasn't here. And the ceremony continued around me with more awards and recognitions, a scholarship presentation for outstanding undergraduates, and a Teaching Excellence Award for a beloved professor, and the standard speeches about bright futures and limitless potential. And everyone kept talking about support systems, and the families who made these achievements possible, and the networks of love that sustained us through difficult times. And each mention felt like salt in a wound that was growing rawer by the minute. And I realized that something was shifting inside me, that the hurt I'd been carrying for years was crystallizing into something sharper and harder. Something that felt less like sadness and more like anger. And I'd spent my entire life making excuses for my parents' absence, telling myself they were busy or distracted, or that Emma simply needed more attention because she was less self-sufficient. But sitting there with empty seats 4 rows back and a plaque in my hands that proved I'd achieved something extraordinary, I couldn't maintain those excuses anymore. And the anger felt clean somehow, felt clarifying, Felt like something I should have allowed myself to feel years ago, instead of swallowing it down and pretending it didn't hurt, that they missed my 8th grade science fair, and my high school awards, and my undergraduate graduation, and now this, the biggest academic achievement of my life so far. And the speeches continued, and more names were called, and the audience applauded and took photographs, and the celebration continued for 300 graduates and their families. And I thought about the speech I was supposed to give in about 20 minutes. The student address I'd prepared and practiced and revised 6 times until it was polished and appropriate and full of the standard platitudes about gratitude and opportunity and the people who believed in us. And I realized I couldn't give that speech, couldn't stand at that podium and thank people who weren't there and pretend I'd had support I hadn't received. And the anger that had been building reached something like resolution. And I made a decision sitting there with my plaque and my empty family section and my perfect academic record that meant nothing to the people whose opinion I'd spent 24 years trying to earn. And I decided that my speech would not lie, would not paper over the truth with comfortable fictions, would not pretend that everyone in this auditorium had come from loving, supportive families who celebrated their achievements, because some of us hadn't. Some of us had learned to celebrate ourselves. And maybe it was time someone said that out loud, and the ceremony moved through its final segments, and I sat there feeling my anger settle into something like determination, something like resolve. And when the announcer said, "We will now hear from our student speaker, Distinguished Scholar Award recipient Maya Chen," I stood up and walked toward the stage, knowing I was about to give a very different speech than anyone was expecting. I walked to the podium carrying the weight of the Distinguished Scholar Award plaque and 24 years of being second choice, and I looked out at the sea of faces in the auditorium, hundreds of graduates and their families, and I could see Priya's family in their section waving and cheering, could see Dr. Chen in the faculty area giving me an encouraging nod, could see Dean Morrison watching me with that same intense concern he'd shown on stage, and I could see the 4th row center section where 4 empty seats sat like an open wound, and I had my prepared speech in my hand. The one I'd written and revised 6 times until it was perfect and appropriate, and full of gratitude for opportunities and support systems and the people who believed in us. But standing there looking at those empty seats, I knew I couldn't deliver those words, couldn't stand at this podium and lie about having support I'd never received. And so I began with the opening paragraphs I'd prepared, thanking the faculty and the administration and acknowledging my fellow graduates. But halfway through the second page, something shifted inside me, and I looked up from my notes, and I went off script, and I said, "But I want to talk about something we don't usually discuss at graduations, something that might make people uncomfortable, but needs to be said." And I could feel the atmosphere in the auditorium change, could sense people leaning forward. And I continued. Some of us in this room achieved what we've achieved without the support we're supposed to have. Some of us celebrated our milestones alone. Some of us learned to be our own cheerleaders because there was no one else in the stands. And my voice was steady, even though my hands were shaking, and I said, some of us worked 3 jobs to pay for school while watching siblings get handed opportunities. Some of us published groundbreaking research that our families never asked about. Some of us are sitting here today having accomplished extraordinary things, and the people who should care most couldn't be bothered to show up. And the auditorium had gone completely silent, the kind of profound quiet that happens when someone speaks an uncomfortable truth. And I looked directly at those empty seats and said, and we're told that makes us independent, that makes us self-sufficient, that we should be proud we did it alone. But the truth is, it's just lonely. It's lonely to celebrate yourself because no one else will. It's lonely to achieve something remarkable and have nowhere to put the joy because the people you want to share it with aren't interested. And I could see people crying now, students and parents both, and I said, but here's what I've learned today. What I want everyone who's celebrating alone to know. Some of us became our own cheerleaders, and that's not inspiring, it's lonely, but it also taught us something crucial. It taught us that our worth isn't determined by who shows up, it's determined by what we achieve, and who we become. And I concluded looking out at all those faces. So, to those celebrating alone today, to those whose families didn't come or left early or never understood what you accomplished, I see you, you matter, your achievements are extraordinary regardless of who's watching, and you are enough exactly as you are. And when I finished, there was a moment of absolute silence, and then the entire auditorium rose in a standing ovation, and I could see tears streaming down faces throughout the crowd, and I knew I'd spoken something true, something that needed saying. And as I returned to my seat with applause thundering around me, I felt lighter somehow, as if speaking the truth out loud had released something I'd been carrying for far too long. After the ceremony ended and we filed out of the auditorium, I expected to collect my things and meet Priya's family for the celebration dinner they'd planned. But instead, I found myself surrounded by strangers, students I'd never met approaching me with tears in their eyes, telling me my speech had spoken directly to their experience. A tall young man in computer science regalia saying his parents had chosen his brother's baseball tournament over his graduation, and he'd felt so alone until I'd said what I said. A woman who looked to be in her 30s, completing an executive MBA, telling me her husband had dismissed her achievement as just a degree, and hearing someone else name that loneliness had made her feel less invisible, and then parents of other graduates were hugging me. Complete strangers pulling me into embraces and thanking me for speaking for their children who'd been too afraid to admit they felt unsupported. And I stood there in my regalia with my plaque still clutched in both hands, feeling overwhelmed by this outpouring from people I'd never met. And Dr. Chen found me in the crowd with tears streaming down her face, and she pulled me aside and said, "Maya, that was the most honest graduation speech I've heard in 20 years. You spoke truth that needed speaking, and I am so incredibly proud of you." And her voice broke on the last words, and I realized she wasn't just proud of my research or my grades, but of my courage to be vulnerable in front of hundreds of people. And then Dean Morrison was approaching with another man I recognized from university materials as Dr. James Walsh, the university president, and Dean Morrison's expression was intense and purposeful as he said, "Maya, your speech moved everyone in that auditorium. I want to hear more about your family situation." And I hesitated because I'd already exposed so much and wasn't sure I wanted to elaborate. But something about his tone suggested this was important, so I admitted that my parents had skipped my graduation for my sister's boyfriend's birthday party, and I watched Dean Morrison and President Walsh exchange a look that contained entire conversations, and President Walsh said, "And this is the student who published in Nature Biomedical Engineering? The one with the full ride to Stanford?" And Dr. Chen confirmed, "Yes, Maya is the first master's student in 15 years to publish in that journal. She's being courted by research labs across the country. Stanford offered her a complete funding package worth over $180,000 because her work is that exceptional." And President Walsh's expression shifted from surprise to something that looked like determination, and he said, "Wait here, don't leave yet." And he stepped away, making a phone call while I stood there confused about what was happening. And Dean Morrison was watching me with that same intense concern he'd shown on stage, and I had the sense that something significant was about to occur, but I couldn't imagine what. And around us, the crowd was still buzzing about the speech, and people kept approaching to thank me, and I felt simultaneously exposed and validated, as if speaking my truth had cracked something open that couldn't be closed again. President Walsh returned from his phone call, and Dean Morrison turned to me with an expression that was both gentle and determined. And he said, "Maya, I need to ask you something that might seem unusual, but I'd like your parents' contact information." And I felt confusion wash over me because I couldn't imagine what he wanted with their phone numbers. But I pulled out my phone and provided both their cell numbers and my mother's email address. And Dean Morrison entered the information into his phone with careful precision before looking up at me and saying, "We have some discretionary celebration funds for exceptional students, and I'd like to arrange something special for you, but I need to make a call first." And then he asked, "Where are your parents right now? What's the name of the venue for this birthday party?" And I told him, the Skyline Room downtown. And I watched as his jaw tightened, and he exchanged another one of those meaningful looks with President Walsh before he stepped a few feet away and made a phone call, and I could hear one side of the conversation as he said in his formal dean voice, "Yes, this is Dean Richard Morrison from the university. I'm calling from the graduation ceremony that just concluded. I need to speak with Maya Chen's parents. It's regarding their daughter's graduation today." And there was a pause as whoever answered must have questioned him, and he said more firmly, "Yes, I'm aware they're at an event. This is extremely important and relates to their daughter who just received our highest academic honor. I can be there in 30 minutes, and I need to speak with them in person." And another pause, and then, "Thank you. Please let them know the Dean of Graduate Studies is on his way." And he hung up and turned back to our small group and said simply, "Let's go." And I felt my stomach drop as I realized what he was planning. And I said, "You're going to the party? You're going to Tyler's birthday party?" And Dean Morrison looked at me with an intensity I hadn't seen before and said, "Yes, I am, and you're coming with me." And Dr. Chen said, "I'm coming too." And President Walsh nodded and said, "As am I. This is university business now." And I stood there still holding my Distinguished Scholar Award plaque and my graduation regalia, surrounded by three of the most important people at the university who were proposing to crash my sister's boyfriend's birthday party to confront my parents. And I said, "Dean Morrison, I appreciate this, but maybe we should just let it go. My parents will be embarrassed. It might make things worse." But he shook his head and said, "Maya, you stood on that stage and gave a speech about celebrating a loan that moved 300 people to tears. You published research that will change lives. You achieved something remarkable, and your family chose a birthday party over witnessing it. And I've been in higher education for 30 years, and I have never, not once, had a student of your caliber have their family skip their graduation for something so trivial, and this needs to be addressed because you deserve to have people fight for you since you've spent your whole life fighting for yourself." And his words hit me like a physical force, and I felt tears spring to my eyes, and Dr. Chen put her arm around my shoulders and said, "Let us do this for you. Let someone stand up for you for once." And I nodded because I couldn't speak past the lump in my throat. And the four of us walked toward the parking area with me still in full regalia carrying my award, while Dean Morrison, President Walsh, and Dr. Chen walked beside me like an academic honor guard heading into battle. We drove to the Skyline Room in Dean Morrison's car, a silver sedan that smelled faintly of coffee and leather, and I sat in the back seat still wearing my full graduation regalia with my honors cords draped around my neck, and the Distinguished Scholar Award plaque balanced on my lap. And the weight of it felt both significant and surreal as the city streets passed by outside the window. And I kept thinking we should turn around, that this was a mistake, that confronting my parents at Tyler's birthday party would only make everything worse and more painful. And finally, I said, "Dean Morrison, I really appreciate what you're trying to do. But maybe we should just let this go. My parents are going to be so embarrassed, and it might damage our relationship beyond repair." And Dean Morrison glanced at me in the rearview mirror with an expression that was both gentle and absolutely immovable. And he said, "Maya, I have been in higher education for 30 years. I have seen thousands of students graduate. I have watched families celebrate achievements both large and small. And I have never, not once in 3 decades, had a student of your exceptional caliber have their family skip their graduation ceremony for a boyfriend's birthday party, and this needs to be addressed because what your parents did wasn't just thoughtless. It was a fundamental failure to recognize and honor your worth." And President Walsh turned in the passenger seat to look at me directly and said, "Maya, you're about to represent our university at one of the most prestigious PhD programs in the country. Stanford is investing $180,000 in you because they recognize your potential to make genuine contributions to your field. And your family should understand what that means. They should understand who you are and what you've accomplished." And Dr. Chen reached over from her seat beside me and squeezed my hand and said, "Sometimes families need outside perspective to see what they're missing. Sometimes people who love us can't see us clearly because they've built up patterns and assumptions over years. And maybe hearing from people who do recognize your worth will help them finally see what's been in front of them all along. And I felt tears burning behind my eyes again, and I nodded because I couldn't quite form words. And we drove in silence for a few minutes while I watched the buildings get taller as we approached downtown. And I thought about my parents sitting at Tyler's party right now, completely unaware that the Dean of Graduate Studies and the university president were on their way to confront them. And I felt a strange mixture of dread and vindication, fear and anger, and somewhere underneath it all, a small spark of something that felt almost like hope. Hope that maybe someone standing up for me would finally make my parents see the pattern they'd established, the years of dismissal they'd normalized, the daughter they'd failed to truly see. And then we were pulling up to the Skyline room, and Dean Morrison was parking, and the four of us were getting out of the car, and I was walking toward the venue entrance still in my regalia, carrying my award like physical proof of everything they'd missed. The Skyline Room occupied the top floor of one of downtown's newer buildings, all glass and steel and carefully curated sophistication. And as we approached the entrance, I could hear the bass thump of music and see through the floor-to-ceiling windows the warm glow of string lights and the movement of people celebrating. And my stomach twisted with a complicated mixture of dread and anger and something that felt almost like vindication. And I was acutely aware that I was still wearing my full graduation regalia, the black gown with the royal blue and gold hood that marked me as a graduate studies honoree, the multiple honor cords draped around my neck in white and gold and crimson. And I was still carrying the Distinguished Scholar Award plaque with its engraved brass plate catching the early evening light. And I must have looked absolutely surreal walking through this upscale venue entrance dressed for a ceremony that had ended hours ago. Dean Morrison approached the hostess stand, where a young woman in a sleek black dress stood with a tablet, and he said in his authoritative Dean voice, "I'm here to see the Chen family. I called ahead." And the hostess checked her tablet, and her eyes widened slightly as she looked at our group, taking in my regalia and the three distinguished professionals in their formal attire, and she said, "Yes, the Chen family is expecting you. Please follow me." And she led us through the entrance into the main venue space, and I felt my breath catch because the party was elaborate in a way that made the $8,000 price tag Emma had mentioned seem entirely believable. There was a professional DJ setup with actual stage lighting, round tables with floor-length linens and elaborate centerpieces, a catering station with uniformed servers, a full bar with a bartender mixing cocktails, and balloon arrangements in silver and blue that must have cost hundreds of dollars on their own. And there were easily 80 people in attendance, all dressed in cocktail attire, laughing and drinking and celebrating Tyler's 25th birthday, with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for milestone anniversaries or major life achievements. And I saw a banner stretched across one wall that read, "Happy 25th Tyler," in giant metallic letters. And there was a table covered with professionally wrapped gifts. And I thought about how this party celebrating 1 year in a man's life had been deemed more important than my master's degree graduation, more significant than the Distinguished Scholar Award I was literally holding in my hands, more worthy of my parents' time and attention than watching me receive the highest honor the university could bestow. The hostess led us through the crowd, and I could feel people turning to look at us, their conversations faltering as they registered the strange sight of a graduate in full regalia being escorted by three serious-looking professionals. And then I saw my parents at a table near the windows with Emma beside them, in a rose-colored cocktail dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent. And Tyler sat next to her in a fitted suit, looking relaxed and happy. And on the table in front of them were champagne flutes and small plates of hors d'oeuvres. And my mother saw us first, and her expression shifted from confusion to something like concern as she registered my presence and the presence of the people with me. And my father looked up, and his face went pale, and Emma's expression when she saw me wasn't concern or guilt, but annoyance. Pure annoyance at having her boyfriend's party interrupted, and the hostess gestured to their table and said, "The Chen family." And Dean Morrison said, "Thank you." And we approached while conversations around us died, and more people turned to watch this strange confrontation unfolding. Dean Morrison stepped forward and extended his hand with professional formality and said, "Mr. and Mrs. Chen, I'm Dean Richard Morrison from the Graduate Studies program at the university. This is President James Walsh and Professor Sarah Chen from our biomedical engineering department." And my mother stood up from the table with her champagne flute still in hand, and her face showed confusion mixed with the beginning of concern, and she said, "Is everything all right? Did something happen? Is Maya hurt?" And her immediate assumption that something terrible must have occurred for us to appear here struck me as almost funny because something terrible had happened, just not in the way she imagined. And Dean Morrison's expression remained professionally neutral, but I could see the steel underneath it, and he said, "Yes, Mrs. Chen, something happened. Your daughter received the highest honor our university bestows on graduate students. She published groundbreaking research in one of the world's most prestigious medical journals. She gave the student address to 300 graduates and their families, and she achieved a perfect 4.0 grade point average across 4 years of one of the most demanding programs we offer. And she did all of it without her parents present to witness any of it?" And his words fell into the space around our table like stones into still water, and I watched the ripples spread outward as conversations at nearby tables faltered and stopped, and people turned to look at us, and the silence that had started at our table began spreading through the entire venue as more guests registered that something significant was happening. And my father stood up too, and his face flushed red, and he said, "Now wait just a minute. We explained to Maya that we had a prior commitment. We had already RSVP'd to this event, and Maya understood. She's always been very understanding about these things." And President Walsh stepped forward, and his voice carried the kind of authority that comes from decades of academic leadership, and he said, "A prior commitment to a birthday party for your daughter's sister's boyfriend of 8 months. You chose that over watching your daughter receive recognition that most students only dream of achieving." And the way he said it wasn't a question, but a statement of fact that laid bare exactly how absurd the choice had been. And I saw my mother's face shift from confusion to the beginning of defensive anger, and she said, "Tyler is very important to Emma. They're very serious, and this party has been planned for weeks. We couldn't just cancel," and Maya said she was fine with it. She said she understood. And I felt something crack inside me at hearing her repeat that word understood, as if my understanding somehow made their choice acceptable, as if my capacity to absorb disappointment justified their continued delivery of it. And Emma was standing now too in her rose-colored dress that probably cost $300, and her face showed pure annoyance rather than shame or guilt. And she said, "Excuse me, but this is incredibly rude. You can't just crash Tyler's birthday party and start attacking our family." And Dean Morrison turned to look at Emma directly, and I saw her actually take a step back from the intensity in his expression. Dean Morrison kept his gaze on Emma, and his voice remained level, but carried an edge sharp enough to cut, and he said, "Your sister published research that will help amputees regain full limb function. She's 24 years old and has already contributed more to humanity than most people do in their entire lifetime. And you think a birthday party, a party that happens every single year for every single person, was more important than celebrating that?" And Emma's face flushed red, and she opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out, because what could she possibly say to that? And I saw Tyler shift in his seat, looking increasingly uncomfortable, as more party guests moved closer to our table to hear what was happening. And the DJ had stopped the music entirely now, and the entire venue had gone silent, except for Dean Morrison's voice. And my mother's hand tightened around her champagne flute, and she said with defensive desperation creeping into her tone, "Maya said she understood. She told us it was fine. She's always been so independent and self-sufficient. She's never needed us the way Emma does." And Dr. Chen stepped forward then, and her voice was quiet, but it carried through the silent room, and she said, "Or perhaps Maya learned not to expect your support because it's never been reliably offered. Perhaps she learned to tell you she was fine, because expressing her needs resulted in disappointment." Perhaps your daughter's independence isn't a personality trait, but a survival mechanism. And I felt tears prick at my eyes because Dr. Chen had articulated something I had never been able to put into words myself, and my father was looking at me now with an expression of dawning horror, and he said, "Maya, honey, we didn't realize. We thought you preferred to do things on your own." And I felt a laugh bubble up that came out sounding more like a sob, and I said, "I told you I was receiving the Distinguished Scholar Award. I told you I was giving the student address. I told you this was important to me. I have told you for my entire life that these things mattered, and you chose not to hear me." And my voice was shaking, but I kept going because 24 years of swallowed words were finally forcing their way out. And Dean Morrison gestured to the award plaque I was still holding and said to my parents, "Do you even know what this is? This is the highest honor we bestow on graduate students. It comes with a cash prize of $5,000 and recognition at the national level. Maya's name will be engraved on a permanent plaque in our graduate studies building alongside the names of exceptional scholars going back 40 years, and only one student receives it each year out of over 300 graduates." And he paused to let that sink in, and I could see my mother's face crumbling as she began to understand the magnitude of what they had missed. And more party guests had gathered now, forming a ring around our table, and I could see their expressions ranging from shock to sympathy to judgment as they watched my family's dysfunction play out in the middle of Tyler's birthday celebration. And Tyler himself cleared his throat and said quietly, "Mr. and Mrs. Chen, maybe we should have rescheduled. I didn't know about Maya's graduation when I planned this." And Emma turned to glare at him with betrayal in her eyes and said, "Tyler, don't." But he shook his head and said, "Emma, your sister published in Nature. Do you understand how big that is? My brother's in medical school and he talks about Nature publications like they're winning the lottery." And Emma's face flushed darker and she said, "So what? Maya's smart. We all know that. But this is your birthday. You only turned 25 once." And Dean Morrison said with barely contained frustration, "And Maya will only earn her master's degree once. Will only receive the Distinguished Scholar Award once. Will only give the student address once. These are not repeatable events. And your parents chose a birthday party over witnessing their daughter's extraordinary achievements." Dean Morrison looked directly at my father, and his voice carried through the silent venue with the weight of 3 decades in education, and he said, "I've been in higher education for 30 years. I've seen thousands of students walk across that stage. And students like Maya come along once in a decade, if you're lucky. She represents the absolute pinnacle of what a university education can produce. And Stanford University is giving her a full scholarship worth $180,000 because they recognize her potential to revolutionize prosthetic technology and change the lives of millions of people who have lost limbs." And he gestured to the award plaque I was still clutching against my chest and said, "Do you even know what this is? Can either of you tell me what your daughter is holding right now?" And the silence from my parents was answer enough, and Dean Morrison's expression hardened further, and he said, "This is the Distinguished Scholar Award, the highest honor we bestow on graduate students. It comes with a $5,000 cash prize, and Maya's name will be engraved on a permanent plaque in our graduate studies building alongside exceptional scholars going back 40 years. Only one student receives it annually out of over 300 graduates, and the selection committee spent 2 months reviewing candidates before unanimously choosing Maya." And I could see my mother's face crumbling as the magnitude of what they had missed began to truly sink in. And even more party guests had gathered now, forming a crowd 3 deep around our table, and I could hear whispers spreading through the venue as people who had been celebrating Tyler's birthday realized they were witnessing something far more significant. And Tyler cleared his throat and said with genuine regret in his voice, "Mr. and Mrs. Chen, I think maybe we should have rescheduled this party. I didn't know about Maya's graduation when Emma and I picked this date. If I had known it was this important, I would have changed it." And Emma whirled on him with betrayal written across her face and said, "Tyler, don't you dare take her side." But he shook his head and said, "Emma, your sister published in Nature. Do you understand how incredible that is? My brother is in medical school at Johns Hopkins, and he talks about nature publications like they're winning the lottery. He says most researchers go their entire careers without publishing in journals like that. And Emma's face flushed an even deeper red, and she said with desperation creeping into her voice, "So what? Maya has always been smart, we all know that. But this is your birthday. You only turned 25 once. This party cost $8,000. And the way she said it revealed that she still didn't understand. That even now, with Dean Morrison and President Walsh standing in front of her, explaining exactly what I had achieved, she still thought Tyler's birthday party held equivalent weight. And Dean Morrison turned back to Emma and said with barely restrained frustration, "And Maya will only earn her master's degree once, will only receive the Distinguished Scholar Award once, will only give the student address once, will only have her research featured in Nature Biomedical Engineering once. These are not repeatable events. Birthdays happen every single year for every single person. But the kind of achievement your sister has accomplished happens maybe once in a lifetime if it happens at all." And President Walsh added, "Maya's research on neural integration for prosthetic limbs has already attracted attention from 3 major medical device companies and 2 research hospitals. She's 24 years old and already receiving inquiries about consulting work that could pay 6 figures. The trajectory she's on is extraordinary." And my father was crying openly now, and he reached toward me and said, "Maya, sweetheart, I didn't realize. We thought graduation was just a formality. Just walking across a stage. We didn't understand it was this significant. We didn't know about the award or the speech or any of it." And I felt something break open inside my chest, and I said, "I told you, Dad. I told both of you exactly what was happening. I told you I was receiving the Distinguished Scholar Award. I told you I was giving the student address. I told you this was the most important day of my academic life, and you chose not to listen. You chose not to hear me because you've been choosing not to hear me for 24 years." And my voice cracked. But I kept going because these words had been building inside me for so long, and they needed to come out. And my mother reached for me with tears streaming down her face and said, "We can leave right now. We can come celebrate with you. We can make this right." But I stepped back from her outstretched hand and said, "The celebration is over, Mom. It ended 3 hours ago when I walked across that stage and accepted this award and gave my speech and looked out at 300 people and saw the 2 empty seats where you should have been sitting." And the finality in my voice seemed to hit her like a physical blow, and Dean Morrison said to my parents, "Maya will be featured in the university magazine next month. Her research will be presented at the International Conference on Biomedical Engineering in Geneva this fall. Stanford's faculty are already discussing her potential for revolutionary breakthroughs in neuroprosthetics. You should be aware of who your daughter is and what she's accomplished, even if you haven't been paying attention for the past 2 decades." And I turned toward the exit because I couldn't stand there anymore, surrounded by Tyler's birthday decorations and my family's belated recognition. And Dr. Chen put her hand on my shoulder, and President Walsh nodded at me with respect, and the 3 of them escorted me toward the door, and behind us the party had gone completely silent. The DJ had packed up his equipment, guests were gathering their things and leaving because the celebration had died the moment we walked in, and I glanced back once to see Emma crying with her face in her hands, and Tyler standing awkwardly beside her, looking ashamed, and my parents frozen at their table staring after me as if they were finally seeing me clearly for the first time in my entire life and couldn't believe what they had been missing. Outside the venue, the evening air felt cool against my overheated face, and President Walsh said, "Maya, the university would like to host a proper celebration for you next week. We have discretionary funds for exactly this kind of situation. You can invite anyone you'd like." And I thought about Priya's family, who had welcomed me into their celebration without hesitation, and Dr. Chen, who had mentored me through 4 years of research, and the other students who had approached me after my speech with tears in their eyes. And I said, "I'd like that. I have a family I'd like you to meet, the one I chose." And Dr. Chen hugged me tight and whispered, "We're so proud of you." And for the first time that day, I felt the tightness in my chest begin to ease. 2 weeks later, my parents reached out with a letter, not a text or a casual phone call, but an actual handwritten letter that arrived at my apartment. And in it, they apologized with a specificity and depth I had never heard from them before. They asked to understand my research. They requested information about the Geneva conference. They asked if they could attend the university's celebration, even though they knew they hadn't earned the right. And they said they wanted to be part of my life properly if I would let them try. I sat with that letter for 3 days before responding, and when I finally called them, I set boundaries that I had never dared establish before. I told them I would give them a chance to show up differently, but that one more dismissal would be the last. I told them I needed them to see me as I actually was, rather than who they had decided I should be. And I told them that Emma's life events would never again take precedence over mine, simply because she demanded more attention. My mother cried and agreed to everything. My father said he would spend the rest of his life making up for what he had missed, and I told them we would see, because words were easy, but patterns took years to build and years to break. The university celebration happened on a Friday evening in the faculty club, and Priya's entire family came, and Dr. Chen brought her husband, and Dean Morrison gave a toast that made me cry, and my parents sat quietly at a corner table watching me be celebrated by people who had seen my worth when they couldn't, and I think that might have taught them more than any confrontation ever could. Stanford started in the fall, and my research continued and expanded, and slowly, carefully, with clearly defined boundaries, my relationship with my parents began to rebuild into something more honest than it had ever been before. But I also learned that some of the most important family I would ever have was the family I chose, the mentors who believed in me, and the friends who celebrated my victories, and the community of people who saw me clearly and loved what they saw. I celebrated myself now. I knew my worth independent of anyone else's validation, and that knowledge was the real gift that graduation day had given me, wrapped in pain but precious beyond measure.